This is why people can have comfortable lives, stable income, endless content, yet still feel hollow. It's not that they're ungrateful. It's not that they lack drive. It's that their creative impulse has been outsourced. So when work turns into endless output with no ownership, and life outside of work turns into pure consumption, the nervous system doesn't register fulfillment. It registers stagnation. This is Hustle Rebels, a podcast for people who know how to grind, but are starting to question the cost. I'm Renee, and here we talk about success, burnout, and nervous system regulation without glorifying exhaustion or sacrificing your health, relationships, or your sense of self, and without pretending ambition is the problem. Let's get into it. If you've ever looked at your life and thought, I'm doing everything right, so why do I feel so disconnected? That's not a motivation problem. That might be purposeful alienation. Quick note before we begin, this episode includes discussion of burnout, identity loss, and a brief mention of passive suicidal thoughts. There are no graphic details, but if that's something you need to take care around, please listen accordingly. Before you hit skip, no, this is not an anti-hustle episode. I need you to stay with me. And before we get in today's episode, I need to preface this with two things. First, we're going to be talking about something that makes a lot of people in the hustle culture immediately just tense up. Marxism, or what most people jump straight into calling communism. I know. Don't come at me. Second, and this matters, this episode is not about discrediting capitalism. I'm not anti-capitalism. I'm not anti-competition. I am not anti-drive, ambition, or getting ahead. Clearly, this is Hustle Rebels. We hustle. We're motivated. We love winning the game. What we're doing here is examining a theory, specifically alienation theory, originally outlined by Karl Marx, not as a political solution, but as a diagnostic lens. You can take insight without adopting ideology. So, before you say, fuck this isn't about hustling, stick with me. Because if you care about longevity, leadership, and not burning yourself out while you're getting ahead, this conversation is very much for you. By the end of this episode, you're going to understand why so many driven, capable people feel disconnected, even when they're succeeding. How hustle culture can quietly turn into identity erosion, and how to stay ambitious without becoming a cog in a system that's slowly draining you. And real quick, if this episode resonates, make sure you're subscribed to the podcast so you don't miss what's coming next. We've got guests joining the show very soon, and I'm genuinely excited about these conversations. So let's rewind a little bit and go back to Marxism. Here's a part where I want to slow down on, because this is where people either completely misunderstand Marx or write him off too quickly. Karl Marx wasn't just sitting around trying to write a motivational speech or a self-help book. He wasn't talking about mindset, and he wasn't talking about hustle. He was observing what happens to humans when they're placed inside very large systems, especially systems that prioritize efficiency, profit, scale, and output over ownership, creativity, and connection. And whether you agree with his conclusions or not, the pattern he identified still shows up today, especially in top-level corporations, high-performance environments, and hustle culture spaces. That's why this reflection matters. Because you don't have to be anti-capitalist to admit that large systems can quietly strip meaning out of work if they're left unchecked. Marx called this alienation. And no, this isn't about hating work, ambition, or success. This is about understanding why so many driven, capable people feel disconnected even when they're doing well. So let's break this down. First, Alienation from the product. Why creation matters and why consumption alone feels empty. Marx said that when workers don't own what they produce, the product becomes something separate from them, something that actually confronts them instead of fulfilling them. Now, let's modernize that. You can create things all day long. Presentations, campaigns, reports, strategies, content, systems, you name it. You solve the problems, you execute, you deliver. And then what? It just disappears. It belongs to the company, the brand, the client, the platform, but not you. You don't see the long-term impact. You don't feel a sense of completion. You just move on to the next thing, which is why so many people end the day thinking, what did I actually do today? And here's the part that matters the most, because this isn't just philosophical, it's also biological. Humans are not just made to consume, we are made to create. There is real evidence across psychology, neuroscience, and anthropology that creating, such as building, shaping, contributing, gives humans a sense of meaning, coherence, and identity. It's tied to motivation, fulfillment, and even nervous system regulation. When we create something as humans and can see it, own it, share it, the brain gets feedback. I exist. I contributed. I mattered. But when your entire day is spent producing things you never get to claim, or worse, passively consuming other people's creations, you lose that feedback loop. So you scroll, you consume, you absorb, you react, but you don't express. Over time, that creates a very specific kind of emptiness. Not because life is bad necessarily, but because a core human function is being bypassed. This is why people can have comfortable lives, stable income, endless content, yet still feel hollow. It's not that they're ungrateful. It's not that they lack drive. It's that their creative impulse has been outsourced. So when work turns into endless output with no ownership, and life outside of work turns into pure consumption, the nervous system doesn't register fulfillment. It registers stagnation. That's alienation from the product, not because creation stopped, but because connection to the creation did. All right, second, alienation from the process of labor. So alienation from the process of labor isn't about what you're making. It's about how you're required to make it. Marx talked about labor becoming forced, mechanical, and externally controlled. Something done to survive rather than something chosen moment by moment. And this is where hustle culture quietly crosses a line, because you can believe in hard work and still be alienated by the way that work is structured. Here's what alienation from the process actually looks like in today's modernized world. Your pace is dictated by systems you don't control. Your priorities are reshuffled by algorithms or leadership or urgency theatrics. Your attention is fragmented across meetings or messages, dashboards, and deadlines. You're not working, you're reacting. The work itself might not be terrible, but the way it's done keeps your nervous system in a constant state of readiness or stress, which naturally increases your cortisol. There's no natural start-stop rhythm, no recovery, no sense of, I'm done for the day. Even rest becomes conditional. And I'm sure some of these are going to sound very familiar, such as, I can relax once I catch up. I can slow down after this launch. I'll breathe when this quarter is over. But the quarter never ends. This is what people miss when they say, well, you chose the job. Yes, you chose the role, but you did not choose constant interruption, artificial urgency, or being tethered to a system that literally never powers down. Alienation from the process of labor happens when you have responsibility without authority, output expectations without control over timing, pressure without influence over the rules. And here's the nervous system truth. The body reads lack of control as threat, not because the work is dangerous, but because unpredictability, surveillance, and forced urgent pace signal unsafety at a biological level. So you stay hypervigilant, you stay alert, productive, and slowly your baseline becomes constant stress, not because you're weak, but because the process never allows for completion. This is why people can enjoy parts of their job, such as their role, but still feel exhausted by it. It's not the actual labor. It's the loss of agency inside the labor. That's the alienation from the process. And no amount of passion can override a system that keeps your nervous system permanently on call. And we have number 3, alienation from others. Basically, when a team is a word, not necessarily a felt experience. This is where corporate culture language really starts to crack. On paper, we're on teams. In practice, we're often competing, comparing, or quietly self-protecting. Everyone's networking. Everyone's branding. You're encouraged to collaborate, but also encouraged to stand out, to support, but not outshine, to be visible, but not vulnerable. So relationships just inherently become transactional. Connections become strategic, and authenticity becomes a liability. Marx talked about how capitalism pits workers against each other. And you can totally see that today in performance reviews, rankings, stack ratings, bonus structures, and hustle culture comparison loops. When outcomes are scarce and visibility is currency, people don't bond, they posture. And here's the nervous system truth that rarely gets acknowledged. Humans are wired for cooperation and belonging. We regulate through safe connection. When relationships feel conditional, such as I'm only valuable here if I perform, your body doesn't relax. It stays alert. That low-grade tension that you feel around coworkers, that's not introversion. It's not you being an introvert. It's not social anxiety. It's your nervous system saying, this doesn't feel safe enough to fully exhale. So people keep it surface level. You keep it professional. You keep it armored, which looks like maturity or professionalism, but feels like isolation. And over time, this kind of environment doesn't just drain energy. It erodes trust, creativity, and resilience. Not because people don't care, but because the system teaches them that caring is risky. And this is all manufactured. And this is where I want to be very clear about something. You don't fix this by burning your career down. You don't fix it by pretending that hierarchy doesn't exist. And you definitely don't fix this by telling people to just communicate better. This is where leadership matters and where you can make a difference. I've heard Jocko Willink talk about this in Extreme Ownership and through EO Academy, specifically the idea of leadership capital. The idea is simple, but very powerful. Every interaction you have as a leader is either a deposit or a withdrawal. You build leadership capital through consistency, accountability, clarity, and actually having your people's backs. And once you've built enough capital, you can spend it by having hard conversations, setting standards, or making changes without blowing up trust. This matters because alienation from others doesn't heal through culture slogans. It heals through felt safety created over time. And here's the part leaders often underestimate. Small daily behaviors matter more than grand initiatives. Things like giving credit publicly and often, making expectations explicit instead of implied, reducing unnecessary competition, taking responsibility as a leader when things go sideways. creating environments where people don't have to guess where they stand. Even as small as just investing in how the person might be doing or what their relationships with their children or their families might even look like, or just asking how their day is. These are micro deposits. They don't dismantle capitalism. They don't eliminate ambition. They don't make people soft. They make teams stable. And stability is what allows people to collaborate instead of protect. So if you're in leadership or moving toward it, this is where your power actually is, not in motivational speeches, not in perks, not in pretending burnout is an individual issue, but in building enough leadership capital that people feel safe enough to stop performing and start contributing. And for the last one, number 4, alienation from self. This is the quiet killer, and it's the one that doesn't get talked about enough. Because you can be productive, successful, and respected, and still be deeply alienated from yourself. Marx believed humans are inherently creative and social beings, that we're meant to engage in meaningful, conscious activity, not just to survive, but to express, connect, and choose. Alienation from self happens when your identity gets reduced to function, not all at once, not dramatically, but slowly over time, it chips away. You stop creating for joy. You stop imagining alternatives. You stop asking what you want, not because you don't care, but because survival starts to feel more important than desire. You learn what's rewarded. You learn what's safe. You learn what performs well. So you adapt. That's what nervous systems do very well. You become what you do. You become what you produce. You become what gets approval. And the parts of you that don't optimize, the curious parts, the expressive parts, the messy, intuitive, imaginative parts, they don't disappear. They just go quiet. And it's not laziness. It's not a lack of discipline. It's also not a mindset problem. That is identity erosion. And here's where hustle culture gets it wrong. You can be ambitious and alienated at the same time. In fact, high performers are often the most alienated people because they learned early on that safety, approval, and belonging came from outperforming. So they don't just work hard, they become the work. Rest feels unsafe. Stillness feels unproductive. And asking, who am I without this role feels threatening. Not because you don't have an identity, but because it's been tied so tightly to the output that separating the two feels like loss. This is why burnout isn't just exhaustion. It's grief. Grief for parts of yourself that were slowly sidelined in the name of survival. And the hardest part, from the outside, it looks like success. Which is why so many people don't realize what they've lost until their body starts forcing the conversation. That's alienation from self. Not the loss of ambition, but the loss of access to who you are outside of performance. And I want to slow this part way down because this isn't theoretical for me. This is personal. For me, alienation from self didn't show up as dissatisfaction or boredom. It showed up as an identity collapse. When I was a firefighter, all 3 of the previous forms of alienation were already in play. I was alienated from the product. I didn't own the outcomes, the decisions, or the direction. I just showed up, performed, absorbed trauma, and moved on to the next call. I was alienated from the process, working 60, sometimes 80 hours a week in a system that dictated pace, manufactured urgency, and sacrifice, without any real say in how that labor was structured or sustained. And I was alienated from others, because when you're exhausted, overworked, and inside a culture that rewards toughness over honesty, connection becomes conditional. You don't talk about what it's costing you, you just keep showing up. And when you live inside that long enough, it doesn't just exhaust you, it replaces you. My identity became the role. My worth became my performance. My value became how much I could endure. So when burnout hit, it wasn't just physical or emotional. It was existential because when the job stopped working, when my body and nervous system finally said no, on top of the physical exhaustion that I was experiencing, there was just nothing underneath it. I didn't just feel tired. I felt purposeless. And this is the part where I'm saying out loud because people need to understand how serious this gets. I didn't actively want to die, but I struggled with passive suicidal thoughts. Thoughts like wishing I'd get into a car accident bad enough that it would just all stop. Not because I wanted to end my life, but because I couldn't imagine how to live without the identity that had consumed me. That's what happens when you work extreme hours for a system that just doesn't care about your well-being. When you're disconnected from those around you. When you're performing a role that no longer feels meaningful. When your humanity is secondary to output. You don't just burn out. You disappear. That's alienation from self. Not because you're weak, not because you couldn't hack it, but because no human nervous system is meant to survive indefinite self-abandonment. And this is why I'm so adamant about this conversation. Because burnout isn't just exhaustion. It's grief for a self you slowly lost while trying to survive. If we don't talk about that honestly, if we just keep pretending hustle only costs energy and not identity or the loss of your relationships, we keep sending people into systems that will hollow them out and then just call it strength, while we're supporting these corporations in these systems that just completely benefit from the loss of ourselves. And if any part of this feels familiar to you, you're not broken and you're not alone. There are ways to rebuild identity without burning your life down. That's what the rest of this conversation is about. I want to take a breath here because when you look at all four forms of alienation together, a pattern becomes obvious. Alienation from the product, process, others, and alienation from self. They all point to the same core issue. Loss of agency. You have loss of ownership, control, connection, and identity. This is why burnout isn't solved by having the weekend off or vacations, or the reason why mindset alone doesn't fix it. And this is why telling people to just be more resilient misses the point entirely. Resilience without agency is just endurance. And endurance has a breaking point. And I want to be crystal clear about where I stand because this matters. Hustling is not the problem. Drive is not the problem. Wanting more for yourself or for your family is not the problem. The problem is hustling without authorship. When the game you're playing slowly disconnects you from what you create, how you work, who you work with, and who you are, that's no longer ambition. That's survival mode dressed up as success. It's a layer of conditioning and beliefs that has been ingrained in our society for us to believe. And the cost of that isn't just energy, it's identity. If any part of this episode felt uncomfortably familiar, I want you to hear this clearly. You're not weak, you're not broken, and you didn't fail at hustling. Your nervous system adapted to an environment that asked way too much of you for way too long. And adaptation is not a character flaw. In fact, it's intelligence. The work now isn't burning your life down. It's reclaiming agency over your life one layer at a time, which is possible. And if you're in leadership or moving toward it, this episode is also a mirror. You don't have to dismantle an entire system overnight. Just not possible. You also don't have to reject capitalism. There's nothing wrong with competition. You don't have to eliminate the competition, but you do have influence. Every expectation you set, every conversation you avoid or engage, every moment you choose clarity over ambiguity, and every time you protect your people instead of posturing, those are deposits. Leadership capital is built daily, quietly, and it's what determines whether people feel safe enough to contribute instead of just to survive. This is how alienation gets interrupted and how people who work with you trust you. not with slogans, with structure, consistency, and ownership. So let's pull this all together. Alienation theory explains why success can still feel empty, why burnout can feel catastrophic, why losing a job or role can feel like losing yourself. The answer isn't less ambition. It's ambition with agency, hustle that doesn't cost you your humanity, success that doesn't require you to erase yourself. And I want you to know this conversation doesn't stop here. I've got guests coming onto the podcast very soon, and I'm genuinely excited about the depth of the conversations we're going to be having around work, identity, leadership, and nervous system stability. I'll also be hosting a free 3-day webinar coming up. More details are coming soon, but it's designed to help driven professionals step out of survival mode and start rebuilding the clarity, agency, identity without burning their entire careers down. The best way to get that information in real time is to join the newsletter. That's where everything drops first. If this episode mattered to you, here are a few simple ways to support the podcast. Subscribe so you don't miss upcoming episodes. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if you'd like to financially support the show, you can do that through the link in the show notes. It helps keep these conversations alive and accessible. And if any of this resonates more deeply than you expected, especially around burnout or identity loss, you're not alone and support exists. You don't have to carry that quietly. This is Hustle Rebels. We don't reject ambition. We just refuse to lose ourselves chasing it. I'll see you in the next episode.